So we got a couple questions about the situation in Ukraine. Obviously, it's very topical at the moment. So the first one comes from Andrew Fagel, who asks, what was the state of gun laws in Ukraine prior to Russia's invasion? He talks about he's seen lots of clips and memes online about Ukrainians buying arms prior to the invasion. But he wants to know, were these semi-automatic rifles that we would recognize here in the States? Were they select fire? I don't know if you want to take that first question.
Yeah, I think the first one there on what was the state of Ukraine's gun laws is a good question, right? We wrote over at The Reload about how they had changed their gun laws right before the invasion actually occurred and adopted this sort of recognition of self-defense and defensive property as a right in Ukraine, which is fairly unusual in Europe. And that was a fairly remarkable thing to happen. And now you've obviously seen a lot of reports of armed civilians defending the country against the Russian invasion, which has now been bogged down there for 2 weeks going. And, they still haven't captured most of their major strategic objectives, like the capital of Kyiv, and the government and the army of Ukraine are still operating despite lots of sort of horrendous slaughter by the invading Russians, including things like bombing maternity wards. But anyway, the Ukrainian gun laws in the lead up to the invasion were fairly similar to what you see commonly in Europe. They're very strict. I mean, I think that's the bottom line, right? Is that they were very strict laws. Europeans have some, I don't know, differences with America. Like there's quirks in all their gun laws that Americans would look at and think are weird. They define things based off of smoothbore versus rifled. We don't do stuff like that in the U.S. They have different age ranges, whether it's 21 to own certain guns and 25 to own other ones. But I think the bottom line is, before the invasion, it was very difficult for the average Ukrainian to legally own firearms in the country of Ukraine. And that's the real significant difference. They had a lot of things like, pistol purchase permits, and that include stuff like psych evaluations and things that even in the strictest states in the United States, you wouldn't see for basic gun ownership. And a lot of it was regulated directly by the Minister of the Interior, which is kind of like their Attorney General,
right?
Their top law enforcement position. And it was almost ad hoc in some ways as well.
I was going to say, one thing that makes it interesting is the fact that they had those strict licensing laws that you would see perhaps an allegory or allegorical comparison in the States would be a place like California or something like that. But they still allowed semi-automatic rifles under their hunting. So if you got a license under a hunting purpose, for example, they considered modern sporting rifles under that license, which is just a funny difference that you wouldn't see that in our stricter states here. So there were semi-automatic carbines owned by civilians as long as they had that license. Prior to this, it just wasn't covered under self-defense, as you said, which was a reform that they just enacted prior to the invasion.
Yeah, and that's somewhat similar to how we treat sporting exceptions here in the United States, especially when you look at things like the National Firearms Act, where, I think AOWs, any other weapons, which you would have to be registered and taxed under the NFA, could apply to anything that has a barrel diameter, I think, of more than half an inch, which would include 12 gauge shotguns, except for the sporting exception. And there's a lot of things like that going on in our own gun laws that, unless you're really digging deep into them, you wouldn't even realize. I think the real main difference, because you could get into a lot of different little minor details, is how difficult it is to obtain a gun legally as somebody who doesn't have a criminal record or hasn't been adjudicated mentally ill as a danger to themselves or others. It's much harder in Ukraine in the lead up to the war, and even now. than it is in the United States. Because now, we had a piece from Anthony Constantini, who's studied over in Europe and is a PhD candidate now, and he's written on some of these issues before. But he wrote a piece for us about the situation in Ukraine and the change in their gun laws. And, even now with the new law, the liberalization that they just underwent, you still have licensing in state-run classes, and you still have a national registry of guns. You still have a lot of guns that are banned for civilian possession that would be legal here in the United States, such as, actually, some of these things are similar to our NFA, short barrel rifles, fully automatic weapons, but they have like different classes of who can own what, sportsmen versus regular civilians versus outright bans. So the law is still pretty opaque in terms of comparisons to the US. It's just that now they've made more of a philosophical change. And obviously this law was passed as something of a statement more than anything, because, they're handing guns out on the street to civilians, fully automatic weapons, military grade stuff that's from their military armories to civilians. So, the law is not really what's governing things in Ukraine while they're in the middle of an invasion, obviously. So the parliament there passed this bill liberalizing their gun laws and recognizing these rights to self-defense as more of a symbolic thing than anything else. And I think that's sort of the important thing to get across, is like their laws before this change were similar to a lot of your other European laws at the top level. It just was much, much more difficult to legally obtain a gun there as a civilian than anywhere here in the United States, even in places like California or Massachusetts, where they have comparatively strict gun laws for America.
Right.
But I think there's a couple more to his question, right? I think he
asked about Zelensky specifically.
What did we find on that? So he said that there's some people have been saying that Zelensky was ran on gun control or was for gun control before the invasion. What did we find on that one? Because we hadn't written about it before, but we looked it up.
Right. Yeah, we found some reporting that I guess a Ukrainian gun rights group tried to start a petition effort to get some of those gun laws that we talked about being so strict, to try to liberalize them a little bit. Mm-hmm. Just last year, even. And I guess he publicly voiced opposition to that effort. And I guess his rationale was that it was premature. And he blamed, this article at least says that he blamed the socioeconomic conditions of Ukraine at the time.
There's an article in, where was it? It's Firearms.
The Firearms News.
Yeah, which is a magazine. And they did a story last year. Actually, it was earlier this year on it, but so he did actually oppose these reforms previously, right?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. At least as recently as last year, apparently he was a vocal opponent to liberalization. And then obviously, when you have a foreign country at your doorstep with guns and tanks, that kind of changes the status quo a little bit. So
yeah, and they did try to pass this exact reform that did end up going into law right before the invasion. They tried to pass that the year before, and it didn't make it through. Really, a lot of the stuff reported in this piece echoes the talking points that I had seen for why that bill didn't make it through the Ukrainian parliament. I think it's called the Rada, last year. And so, it sounds like basically Zelensky was in line with what most of the politicians in Ukraine felt in the immediate run up to this war, which was that they didn't, they weren't yet ready for it. It was sort of this, you hear premature being tossed around a lot when I was reading about this stuff, when I looked into it. And so it's just sort of like, no, they're not ready to liberalize the gun laws there yet. Maybe later on down the line was kind of the argument you had, which is obviously pretty different from what you we hear in the U.S. on how we argue about guns, but in Europe, I think that's a more common take on things, especially in some of these Eastern European countries that didn't exist, 30 years ago.
Sure.
But yeah, and then what was he had another one too, right?
Yeah, he just basically asked, how recent events kind of changed the gun culture in Ukraine. And I think, obviously that caused for a little bit of a speculation on our part, but I think, very clearly they passed the reform before the invasion to recognize self-defense. They're actively arming civilians. So civilians are getting real world firearms experience. You have to imagine it'll have some effect on the gun culture in the country moving forward, for sure.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, though, to note in that is, and certainly this was, like we were just talking about there, this was a symbolic effort more than anything else. Right. Obviously, it is a legal change in how their laws work, but currently Vladimir Putin is trying to topple their entire government and wipe out all of their laws. So, it's more of a symbolic gesture about everyone being in the fight together and having the right to defend themselves or their property or their country. That's sort of more what it seems like they were trying to send with this law. And so, yeah, obviously the idea that civilians shouldn't be armed is probably not very popular in Ukraine right now among Ukrainians who are actively fighting against an invasion by an oppressive foreign government. So, yeah, I think their attitude has probably changed a lot. But one thing I will note is that they've obviously been at war with Russian-backed separatists for the last 8 years.
Right.
Really, since the entire inception of the new Ukrainian government after they overthrew the Putin puppet that was there previously. And so I think that their civilian population is more prepared to fight in a war than most other countries, because from my understanding, at least, the way that they've been fighting the war in the East against the Russian separatists is that they had drafts where they had conscripts go in and serve time for like a year on the front lines and then rotate out, which means that you have a large population of veterans in Ukraine up to this point. And I think some of the estimates that at least Ukrainian officials and generals have given is that number could be up to 400,000 men who fought in that war of the last 8 years. So, that they have more. Obviously, one of the critiques that you get is that this was sort of a late conversion to the idea of an armed populace being beneficial when you're fighting off an invasion of this sort, and that might be detrimental because it doesn't give the population the opportunity to train with firearms before having to use them in this desperate situation. But Ukraine is in a little bit different situation because they have a large population of veterans who've served time actively fighting. So I guess that's one thing I would note in terms of the Ukrainian culture of arms that I think a lot of Americans don't know yet, right?
I was going to say that's a fair point to make. There's fundamentally a different relationship to gun culture, if you want to call it that, when you've actively been fighting for close to a decade or more. So I think that is a good point that you bring up. It might be a different conception of gun culture than maybe folks in America here think of it, just based on that fact alone.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how prepared the civilian population in Ukraine is for a fight like this, because I think they're better positioned than most people realize.